to Unconscious Bias with Lisa Reynolds from IODA. So thank you for joining us this morning. Hopefully you'll get an awful lot from the session, and we can always chat afterwards if there's anything extra that you want to go through. But the aim of this session is to give you the opportunity to explore and self-reflect on the potential for unconscious bias within yourself, but also with the other people around you within your organisation. And then start to think about the different strategies that you might be able to use to respond in a productive, and particularly around developmental, which means we are going to support each other to get better at this. So the objectives is to look at what unconscious bias is, think about the different types that we've got, and understand the link very much between discrimination and unconscious bias, particularly around protected characteristics, and then manage that unconscious bias in ourselves and the others around us. And then always around that development in order to be able to improve what we do and have that inclusive approach. Okay, so here we go. Overall concept then. I'm going to suggest that we all understand that we're naturally unconsciously biased. Now, if we accept that as a concept, then we're able to do something about it. So we're going to look at bias and prejudice and stereotyping, and we'll look at the implications linked to how unconscious bias affects the decision making that we do, because that's what this is all about. You know, I may have an unconscious bias, but how does it then impact on what I do and all of the things around me? So when I'm asking about unconscious bias, one of you, if you're homeschooling at the minute and one of the children came up and asked you, what does unconscious bias mean? How would you respond? What would you answer? And what does it actually mean? So we've got some of the answers coming up. Our first thoughts really important. And our prejudices are linked in there as well. Inbuilt responses. Yeah, now that's showing the knowledge we've already got on the call. So many of you are already very aware of what your unconscious bias is. Unintentionally veering towards an opinion that is yours, whether correct or not. Absolutely. When we start thinking about judgmental, yep. And your immediate thoughts of image of somebody. Okay, so there's lots of things on there. We've also got prejudice and stereotyping without realizing. Yep, absolutely. A set of beliefs has just gone on the screen. Sometimes our unconscious bias will be so ingrained that it will be a belief that we hold that comes out in our behavior. Okay, so official definitions then. This is the bias that happens automatically and it's outside control unless we start to understand what's happening. And it allows us to make quick judgments, which, to be fair, is really important, because if we don't make those quick judgments, sometimes we might be in danger. So, you know, we have a lot of information that comes into our brain and we can't deal with all of it. So we do start to categorize it. What we've got to be really careful of is what categories are we using and how are we making those judgments. It's also what we call our implicit people preferences, which means who are the people that we are more either familiar with or more comfortable around. So in groups and out groups. So out groups, those are the social groups to which we do not think we belong. And we always think of those out groups as being very similar and having similar characteristics, whereas our in group, those are the people who we feel that we most identify with. We think we're quite unique, and we think that the group around us are quite unique. We don't recognize many of those similarities that we would see in that out group. So we can already start to see how we would maybe react differently to people in our in group to people in our out group. And how does it affect us then? Well, it affects us in more ways than people want to believe. Certainly our perception is altered by our unconscious bias, and definitely our attitude. So how we react alters as a result of what's gone in on what we call under the surface. And then behaviours. So how receptive and friendly are we to certain groups of people, even before we've kind of been introduced to them properly in many ways. And this one's really important about how much attention do we pay to that group of people. So we know nothing about them maybe at this time. We've just met them, just come across them. How much attention do we pay to what they've got to say? So if I told you in the introduction that I'm a professor in psychology, would you take what I'm saying more seriously? I'm not, by the way, just put that out there. But would you take what I'm saying more seriously? Because sometimes when we're looking at attention to who we pay the most attention to, okay, if we're talking about a subject matter, that makes absolute sense. But actually, if it's nothing to do with their subject matter, would we still pay more attention to them? And how much do we listen? So how much do we listen to what certain people say? And then this last one. Now, this is the one that I think we need to really concentrate on a lot of what we do, and that's micro affirmations. So this is the small part of our behavior that gives comfort and warmth. It's the small part of our behavior that allows people to feel supported in certain situations. Now, you might have heard of microaggressions. This is the opposite. This is about the care and comfort that we might give to somebody. So think about images that come into your mind when we mention certain jobs. Think about how much attention would you pay to what those people are saying. So here we go, a teacher. So those of you that are homeschooling, you now know a little bit more probably about the role of a teacher, but would we recognize a teacher and would we behave differently in front of them? What about a nurse? And has that altered in the last 12 months maybe? What about an airline pilot? Or an engineer? Now, obviously, if they're telling us things, if an engineer is telling us stuff about the structural bits of a bridge, then it makes absolute sense that we would listen to them. But if they're trying to tell us about weather patterns that an airline pilot might know, would we still have the same impact? What about an electrician or a hairdresser? What about a midwife or a builder? What about a banker or a footballer? And then what about if we've got somebody who's old, male, who's highly educated, maybe white? What about a female? Are we more likely to listen to the male voice or the female voice? Lots of research will tell us it depends what they're saying as to how much we listen. What about somebody who's young, attractive? What about the colour of our skin? What about whether they attend church or they don't eat meat? They're on benefits, they drive an electric car. All of these different things. What if they supported Brexit? And are you a dog person or a cat person? You tend to find that you will move towards the people that you have the love of cats for, or if they're dogs, football fans. And then we've got people who have tattoos. So all of these different things send messages to us, and our unconscious bias makes decisions on what we're going to do with that bit of information. So I'm going to quickly show you a clip. Those of you that are interested in unconscious bias have probably seen this many times before, but I've pulled one bit of the clip out, which is this maths equation, only because people tend to get it wrong in the clip and get a little bit confused. So a bat and a ball equals £1.10. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, then how much does the ball cost? So I'll give you a few seconds to think that through. So if the bat and the ball equals £1.10, if the bat costs £1 more than the ball, then how much does the ball cost? Think about it, because I'm going to show you a little bit of a clip now. We're going to watch a very quick video, and that equation is in the middle. So it'd be interesting to see whether you got the correct answer.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1.10. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10 pence. The answer is actually 5 pence. Many of us choose 10 pence without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
So for those of you that got the answer right, you're probably sitting there a little bit smug. And for those of you that said 10 pence, are probably still trying to work it out. But that's the difference between our instinct and our analysis. So if you're the kind of individual that works on evidence-based information, then you're less likely to make decisions based on your unconscious bias. But we also know our unconscious bias takes us to particular parts of evidence that support our view. So don't be too clever if you think that you're doing it right because you use analysis. One of the other questions is, how do you check your analysis? So here we go then. We've got on the screen an iceberg. Down the right-hand side, we've got life experiences. You'll notice how colourful it is underneath the water because that's what we're like. We are full of all sorts of different things under the surface. Now we've got our values, so we're not going to look too much at those today, but those are the things that we have a feeling response to. So things that we would feel either very negative or sad if somebody did something against it, against one of your values. Equally, if they did something that supported the standard that you set yourself, which is your value, then you'd feel okay, you'd get that warm and fuzzy feeling. Then we've got our beliefs. So our belief system is all the stuff that we know to be true. May not be any facts attached to it, may not be any science to support it, but if it sits within your belief system, then it's real for you. And that can be anything from a religion, it can be around politics, it can be around the kinds of things that you believe, whether it be life on another planet, whether it be testing on animals should be made legal or illegal. There's all sorts of different things that people might have within their belief system. And then we have our unconscious bias. So those, as we just said, are our people preferences. So you can see where it sits within that iceberg of us as an individual. It's under the surface, we can't see it. We can only see it if you choose to bring it above the waterline so that it's visible. And then we've got these two things that are still under the surface, but they're much, much closer to that waterline. So we've got stereotyping, so that's what we call our cognitive bias, and we've got our prejudice, which is our emotional bias. And then above the surface, we've got what we actually do. So we've got what people see, and that's what people will judge about you. They'll see what you do, they'll hear what you say, and they'll also see the stuff that you choose to turn a blind eye to. All right, so your attitude is the stuff above the surface. And stereotypes, generalization, oversimplified, a bit of a caricature, just like a caricature you might have had done on yourself, and they found that you got a pointy left ear or a square jaw that you never even realized you had. Okay, so they exaggerate what's going on. Prejudices, slightly different. These are preconceived ideas based on little or no fact. So it's where you'll spot an individual, be introduced to an individual, you'll then associate and attach them with a group. But the prejudice is where you have a negative association with that group or a negative connotation that you attach to that group. Okay, so different to stereotype, and it's got that negative connotation attached to it. And when we're talking about in the workplace, it's that stereotyping and that prejudice that creates the distance. So whether that be physical distance or an emotional distance, which means we separate out. And sometimes it can be quite minor, other times it can be quite huge. And a lot of it's to do with that microaffirmation stuff that I talked about earlier, which is the small bits of our behavior that deliver warmth. And then we've got discrimination. Okay, so discrimination is that prejudice in action. So it's the stuff below the surface that's coming above the surface and giving somebody less favourable treatment. Now, I've put on the screen there the protected characteristics because these are the things that are written within the UK equality legislation. So this is the Equality Act of 2010, and it names 9 parts of us that are protected in law, so that if you give less favourable treatment to somebody because of those or any one of those, then they have a right to have a redress about it, for you to answer as to why you've done that. So we can see the stuff that below the surface. If you've got prejudices, stereotypes, and unconscious bias linked around to any of those 9 protected characteristics, and they come above the surface, that's why it can be really problematic. So think now for a second about the kinds of prejudices that you hear people talk about where you work. So think about the conversations you overhear. We may not be hearing quite so many of them now that we're working virtual and we're working maybe away from the office space or away from site. But what kinds of prejudices do you hear? Just with your work colleagues, but generally. So we've got some stuff in gender. So start thinking now, that might be one of the groups. What kind of things? Give me some examples. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So we've got one there about labourers. And interestingly, I watched The Chase last night, and there was I think it was The Chase, and there was an electrician on there. And as soon as they said he was an electrician, and as soon as I saw he was wearing a hoodie, I thought, oh, this would be interesting. And I had to kind of correct myself because actually he did really, really well. Why wouldn't he? Okay, that's my unconscious bias coming out when I'm sat on the sofa of an evening watching The Chase. So we've got loads of things coming on the screen there now, haven't we? Yeah, so young people more agile and adaptable. Okay, there's lots of different ones. We've got a whole host. Interestingly, when we talk about some which we might say have got analysis behind them, so intelligence led, we might hear things that say older people's hearing is likely to be less strong as young people. Okay, now that might be intelligence-led information that says, on the whole, generally, the medical profession would tell us that we may have more hearing loss as we get older. That's not a stereotype. It's not unconscious bias. It's an analysis based around evidence. But what's really important is it doesn't mean that everyone of a particular age group may have poorer hearing. So we've got loads of things coming on there. Yeah, some really interesting ones, and we'll have a look as we go through as to how many of those make a difference on what we think and feel at work. So it's about judging those from other countries re-COVID. We've got a lot of that at the minute, and sometimes our politicians and our media isn't helping. Okay, so our roots of our prejudice then. So all of that stuff that's on that screen, all of that stuff that you've just inputted into your smartphone, let's have a look at where it comes from. And we've got what we call the roots of prejudice. So if those were negative connotations attached to particular groups, then they came from one of 5 particular areas. They were either part of your upbringing, which means whoever you were around at the time you were growing up would have been giving you information that would be feeding in to your prejudices. So anything probably under the age of about 20 would be classed as your upbringing. Then we've got ignorance. So how many of the bits of information are we hearing, listening to, watching on social media with our friends which aren't fact checked? Yeah, so how much of it is just a lack of knowledge? And certainly when we look at some of the stuff that's been written about asylum seekers, some of the ignorance around the statistical data that's there is solely unreliable. And then we've got vulnerability. So some of those prejudices will be based around your fears and feeling vulnerable about particular groups of people. So if we're told that certain groups of people do things that are quite frightening, then we will have a prejudice towards that group of people pulled out from our vulnerability. And then we've got conformity. So this one's really important from a work perspective as well, because this is about when people group together. When people group together and we have group think, we get prejudices that are based out of conformity. And if you removed that individual from the group or you spoke to them separately, they wouldn't have the same kind of view on things. They only do it when they're in the in-group. And again, there's some complicated reasons as to why we do that, but it's important to realise that just because somebody says it in a group doesn't necessarily mean that it's a prejudice, a personal prejudice that they hold. And then we've got power. So this is about the power of the majority group. So we know that people in power will often have negative connotations attached to minority groups. So it's all about how we see things. So what do you see? Can you change between the 2 different images on the screen? and how much can we shift around our unconscious bias about the different impacts that it has on our everyday decision making. So different kinds of unconscious bias then. There are about 12 or 13 that are recognized. I've got a few of them on here just to help us look at the ones that we're probably more likely to come across. Now, affinity bias, lots of people know about that. It's certainly something when we look at recruitment, we have a lot of issues around people recruiting people who share the same similar backgrounds. And if within your organization you've got a referral scheme for hiring people, then that will tell us we're more likely to perpetuate recruiting people like us. Okay, nothing wrong with the system, but actually it works against some of the time when you're trying to have more diverse workforce, more diverse people stepping on the start line for your recruitment process. Confirmation bias. So noticing or looking for evidence which confirms your ideas. So remember what I said before, we will quite often look for analysis and evidence to back up what we're choosing to do. But be careful of confirmation bias. Be careful of where you're looking for your evidence. Then we've got social comparison. So that's about how different groups of people compete against each other. And then stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is where an individual who would identify as being from a minority group or a group that has a negative stereotype or a prejudice against them, they have a fear of being viewed through that lens. So they quite often behave completely opposite in order to not be seen as that stereotypical person from that group, which means actually when we're trying to bring our whole self to work, that can be quite problematic. I remember stereotype threats. I was a woman working within the police sector many years ago, and I didn't have any pictures, any photographs of my children on my desk, and that was because I was working in a very male-dominated environment, and actually I didn't want to be seen as a mother of three under fives. So I kept those photographs tucked away. Would I do that now? Of course not. But I'm talking 20, 25 years ago when that was the case. So stereotype threat. Be careful if you are behaving in a way that's completely opposite to how you want to be. Just check and think about why. Then we've got gender bias. We had some of those that came up when I asked you about prejudices. And then observational bias. This is the bit around suddenly noticing things that we didn't notice before. Now, this can work in our favour or it can work against us. After today, it'll be useful for you to reflect back and think about how many times have you seen unconscious bias coming through in people's behaviour? What about the stereotypical view of particular situations that they might be talking about? What about prejudices? How often in the next few days are you going to hear people say something that's vastly negative about a whole group of people? And then you can make a choice as to whether that comment goes challenged or unchallenged. If you choose to not challenge a prejudice when it's voiced in front of you, then people will make an assumption that you agree. So it's up to you whether we stop people using prejudice comments in our company, and that's all about the way in which you go about it. And then the anchoring effect. Tendency to compare and contrast only a limited set of items. So a little bit confirmation bias where we look for evidence that supports our own view, but the anchoring effect means we get hooked in really quickly to just a couple of bits of information and we can't be moved. All right, so think about how widely you access information, how widely you check stuff out, whether you fact check and who you discuss stuff with. Interestingly, some research, this one's really current and useful to have a look at, although it was done some time ago, but it's been done more recently and it has the same results. So people were playing video games, and during the game they were asked to decide whether somebody was carrying a gun or whether it was something else that was a non-threatening object. And they were told to shoot when the intruder was carrying a gun and to press another key if they were carrying that benign object. And the results showed that we were far higher to shoot if the black intruder was holding a benign object or a gun. Now, what's really interesting about this piece of research is the black participants behaved in exactly the same way as the white participants because of how they've been brought up. So it's that bit that says, actually, when we start looking at research, it tells us that if we are housed within particular areas, particular social groups, then we will have very similar biases, regardless of which group we come from. which is why we'll see some women that have got some real sexist views, or they'll make negative comments about other women. And you'd assume that maybe they wouldn't because they're a woman, but it's not the case. And research shows us time and time again that that's not the case. So I've put another iceberg on the screen now for you to have a look at. Again, when you get the slides through, think this through within your organization, within your team, within your department. This is the kind of slide that is useful to start a debate around the table as to what you're doing and how good you're doing it. So this is an iceberg model by a guy called Edgar Schein, and it talked about the task. So what are we doing as an organization? Okay, what's all the stuff that we've got written in our policies and our procedures? What's up there within the organization? Then underneath the surface, this is about people. This is about us, me, you, the people that you're working with. So what do we think and feel about the task? So that's all that personal iceberg stuff that we've just had a look at. And it tells us how much we engage with the task. And then we've got the culture. So the stuff that's deep rooted within the organization is, what do we actually do around here? So that's that unwritten stuff in the culture within your organization. You've got a variety of different cultures operating around your business areas. So what this is asking us to think about is, if we're trying to embed stuff within culture, we need to make sure that our task is right. We need to make sure that we haven't got any bias attached to our task. So for example, if we have a hiring system that uses a referral, then we could say that there is a piece of bias, possibly, within the way in which you recruit new staff. Or is it only certain staff that you recruit in that way? And do they tend to be more senior? And then you find the more junior members of staff are recruited through a recruitment agency, which means you might get more diversity at the bottom of the organization, but does it move through the organization to senior levels? So again, when you're sat around the table, start thinking about all of the different strategies and policies and procedures you've got in place, and do they support your organization around unconscious bias, or do they work against it? So what policies and procedures have you got in place that offset bias? So what have you already done? Because you're doing so much within construction. So many things are happening. But think for a second about what you've got in place to offset any bias that you might have within your policies. Okay, so there's a lot of things there around equality policies. Now, if your equality policies are working, what that means is that you've got a policy at the top of the organisation in task, and that wherever we go within the organisation, we'll see it living and breathing. And if people don't, then there are consequences. So again, when you've got policies in place, it's not just the policy, but it's how we manage it. There's plenty of stuff coming up there. So mixed interview panels, brilliant. Assuming you've got the right people on the panel and you haven't got somebody there just because they're from a particular group, that's tokenism. So we've got to make sure we've got the skills in the right place, but you're absolutely right. Mixed interview panels are a great idea. Removing names from CVs. Yeah, so what we call blind CV check-in. That's a really important way of removing unconscious bias from your hiring and your recruitment. And that's the bit around getting people to the start line, remember. Okay, once we're in the system, it's not so important, but even getting people to that first level of interview is important. Yeah, gender wording bias in recruitment is a good one. Yeah, how are you recruiting? What images are you using? What kind of words are you using? Are you going down the route of having a hire poster that's got, somebody black, somebody white, a female? Have you got somebody in a wheelchair? Because if you have, then again, that quite often looks like tokenism. Yeah, so we've got some more sophistication now around hiring and what that looks like around imagery, because otherwise we assume that disability is only to do with wheelchair users, which is massively, massively wrong and would kick into our unconscious bias. And again, there are certain things around that we see that reinforce some of those biases. For example, whenever we look at disabled access, it will always have the sign of a wheelchair, again, which reinforces that unconscious bias we have that disability is always connected with a wheelchair, and most disabilities are hidden. Okay, so we've got lots and lots of answers there, and these will come through to you on a chart so you can have a look at them. Thank you for that. The next question then is about how confident are you that what you've got in place works? Because it's all great having an equality policy. In fact, I could send you a dozen that I could pull off the internet now and send them across to you. So having a policy is one thing. What we want is you to know that all of the other things that you're doing are supporting it. And what's really good there is we've got a real mixture, and that's exactly what I'd expect. Okay, you know that it's probably working in some of the areas. Mostly confident. One of the questions you might want to ask after today is when you look at those policies, how are you checking them? So I've just seen one about an engagement survey. It scores highly on the feedback. Brilliant. Okay. Mixed but getting better at graduate level. Yep. Okay. I know what that will be referring to, and you're absolutely right. The way in which you might be bringing people in to the organisation is much more diverse. What we've also got to be careful of is what about further up in the organisation? Yeah, and there's another one there. People will convert to type and bias when they're stressed. Yeah, we certainly know that work pressures make a big difference. Yeah, think about your baseline. What are you checking it against? Who are you confirming your stuff with? Okay, so brilliant. Some great stuff on there around what you've got in place. And remember when we talked about culture, okay, I've put the 9 visible elements of culture there. So again, when you get the slide deck through, have a look. Think about what artifacts you've got. Think about the stories and the histories that people talk about. Think about the different rituals. And then who are the heroes and leaders? Who is held up as the one on the pedestal? Is that in line with what your organisation is trying to achieve within its strategy? Or is it somebody else? So are you saying on one hand, this is what we're trying to achieve, but then you are rewarding a whole range of other people who are doing the complete opposite? Symbols, yeah, and symbolic action. What does that look like? So think that through. That will help you try and work out whether or not the culture at the base of that iceberg is matching your structure. Really good example I use often is I work a lot within the fire service, and they have a huge piece of work, and they've been doing it a very long time, and they're very, very good at it. And that's around their positive action campaigns to recruit more women into the organisation. But I still go into some fire services, and the artwork that they've got on the walls is of men carrying women and children out of burning buildings. They've still got the cabinet that's got all of the trophies from the sports that they've won over the years. And I checked one quite recently, and there was a trophy in there. The last trophy won was in 1985, and they've still got the trophy cabinet in the corner. Yeah, so think about what your organisation shows within the artifacts that it has around the building. And then the other thing to consider, and I know this is really important in construction, is what about the different elements of subculture? So what about your geographical separation? What does that look like? And where does your unconscious bias impact on that kind of thing? What about different functions and departmental designation? How important is that? And how often do you go straight to maybe site behavior as your go-to, and you forget boardroom behavior, which sometimes on occasions can be shocking? Yeah, so again, think about the elements of subculture that exist and how you respond and behave towards them. So how might your bias affect your decision making? We won't spend too long on this one because I think, judging by the previous slide that we did, you've probably covered most of this off in your last answer. But how might your bias affect your decision making? It's interesting there. The first one to come up was lack of fairness, and the second one, making wrong decisions. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Listening to more white males, respecting their opinion more. I'm completely with you on that. Okay, because if we really truly believe around diversity and understanding difference, we'll recognize that there is a lot of diversity within your white male population. Okay, do not dismiss them. Really important members of the team. What we want to do is ally some of our minorities so that we can have a better understanding of what's happening. And don't assume just because somebody isn't black that they wouldn't have a view or an opinion or a life experience that's important. Let's not assume that if somebody is heterosexual, they couldn't possibly have any understanding about somebody who wouldn't identify as heterosexual. So there's all sorts of different things in there. Making a decision, not actually realizing it's a bias. Yeah. Okay. So we've got plenty of stuff in there for us to work through. So methods to beat our bias then. Structure for success. All right, so make sure your structures are right and that you are collecting data. So those of you that have put that you have just run your health and wellbeing questionnaires, or you've just put out a survey, brilliant. Let's check what your questions are. Yeah, make sure your questions have been asked in the right way to make sure there's not a bias. And then what are we going to do with the information we've got? Evaluate subtle messages. So sometimes people won't say it as clearly as we might like, and there'll be some underlying messages that's coming through. And then the final one, which is probably the most important one, if you've seen any of my stuff before, you'll know as an inclusive leader, as somebody who understands their leadership shadow, calling it out is absolutely crucial in what we do. So, as far as your personal development goes, think about Johari's window. All right, think about you as an individual. And those of you apologists that don't know Johari's window, this was a piece of work that said that everybody is like a window and they've got 4 panes of glass within that window. And the more we give feedback and the more we take risk and disclose information about us, the better and more informed we will be as an individual. Okay, so the first pane of glass was the open area. So this is the bit that says, this is what I know about me and that everybody else sees. Okay, so it's open. The second pane of glass is my blind spot. So this is the bit that everybody else sees about me and I don't. So whether I and ah, or whether I do certain things, I've got odd facial expressions, all of that kind of stuff, blind spot. Then we've got the hidden area, which is our facade. So this is the bit that I know about me, but nobody else knows. Or maybe I have a different level of facade depending on who I'm with. So if I'm with my friends, then my facade will come down. If I'm with my colleagues at work, it will be higher. And if I'm out with other clients, then my facade will be much higher. And then we've got the unknown area. So this is the bit that I've never been in. I don't know if I'm any good at it. I couldn't tell you, I've never tried it. And that's that unknown. Now we know by giving feedback and giving people good, honest feedback about their behavior, we have the opportunity to widen that blind spot, to develop my knowledge and understanding. And then hopefully that facade will come down slightly so that I can bring more of myself to work, be who I want to be within that workplace. So Johari's window, really good model for you to have a look at and see, if you're demonstrating unconscious bias, who's giving you feedback, or who could you ask to give you feedback? But another model that you might want to have a look at is called the orgy model. And everybody knows I giggle at this because I'm just really childish. But the orgy model is the way in which we focus on what goes on inside our head. So what happens when we're watching a particular situation? So first off, we observe it. We observe what's happening. And then we react emotionally. Okay, so all of this is happening. Think of what was under the surface of that iceberg of you, your values, your beliefs, your unconscious bias, your prejudice, and your stereotyping. And that's where we start to make that judgment. And then we make an intervention. So we now intervene, making decisions and taking based on what we feel, and we conclude. Now, in order to be better at what we do, we have to put in a fuse. We need to stop between the react and the place in the judgment. So by taking just a little bit of time to assess what's going on, then we're more likely to make a decision that's not based on an unconscious bias. But it takes practice. We need to think it through and we need to call stuff out. So when we're thinking about the professional standards of the organisation that you work for, we need to think about all of the behaviour that falls below that standard. So that's what we're talking about, calling it out. We don't want to overreact. We just want to say if things are happening in front of you, linked around maybe people's unconscious bias, maybe it's linked around a prejudice that they've got, or maybe they're making a wildish statement, which is a stereotype. Things that fall below the line, let's put them into 3 categories. So we've got clumsy, we've got inappropriate, we've got unacceptable. And what we want you to be able to do is take the comment from the individual, hook it somewhere along that line, and then react back to them in a professional, skilled way. That doesn't mean they're going to like what you're going to say, but we want you to be able to say it in the best possible way. So stuff that falls below clumsy, this means they genuinely, absolutely, hand on heart, did not mean to say what they said, or they had no idea that what they had just said was likely to cause offence. Right? So clumsy. Now, when somebody's clumsy, if we just kind of play it back to them, or kind of just check out with them and say, I'm not sure that's what you meant, or can you just explain that in a little bit more detail because that's coming across as quite rude, or that's coming across as a little bit of a stereotype, then most people, if they didn't realise what they were doing, will go, oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm really sorry. And they'll reframe it in a way that's more appropriate. Okay. So clumsy. We can cut most things off at clumsy if we challenge at the right time, as soon as it occurs and in front of everybody else. Now, inappropriate, that's a little bit more sinister and it's a little bit more difficult because inappropriate behaviour tends to occur when people have looked around, seen whether the in group is present or whether there's anybody from the out group present. And if the in group's there, then they're going to go ahead, which needs a challenge because actually it wasn't accidental. They knew exactly what they were saying. They just thought the people around them were going to go along with them. So if you're the kind of person that's hearing stuff quite often that concerns you, the chances are the people that you're with think you're okay with it. Because if you'd have called it, they probably wouldn't do it. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule because people will do it on purpose to annoy people. But generally speaking, if we call it out and enough people call it out, they'll stop that behaviour. And then we've got at the far end the unacceptable stuff. So this is where we normally have to escalate it up. It has to go somewhere else because actually we need to get this dealt with. Now that's the kind of stuff that breaches the legislation. So go back to the previous slide, which has got the 9 protected characteristics. If it breaches that, the chances are it's unacceptable and it needs to be dealt with formally. Okay, so don't try and deal with it on your own in a quiet conversation in a corner. We do that sometimes if it's inappropriate, but we normally do it in front of everybody else. Clumsy and inappropriate, unacceptable. Let's take it somewhere else. Let's inform somebody else and let's get it dealt with properly. Doesn't mean somebody will lose their job. But remember, when we're looking at the professional standards of the organisation, we're looking at them being anti-discriminatory, not non-discriminatory. Okay? Non-discriminatory means I as an individual won't discriminate. Anti-discriminatory means whenever I see anybody else discriminate, I'll do something about it. Okay, so we want it to be anti-discriminatory. And remember, when you challenge an individual, you're probably challenging what we call their equilibrium. So you're giving them some disconformation information that they didn't know beforehand, or that they certainly didn't think they were doing. And what we've got to remember is at the point where you give disconformation information, you throw people into a disorientated state. And that disorientation can have a whole range of sadness attached to it and negative feelings. Okay, it's a natural response though. Whenever somebody gives us disconformation information, it throws us into a disorientated state. And what we have to do is we have to explore what's going on. We explore what's going on for ourselves and for the other person if we're able to. Stop people going back to their old equilibrium and ignoring what it is that you've just told them. So we give people feedback, we push them round into reorientation so that they get back to a new equilibrium that's different to the one that they had before. So this is what we call the adult learning cycle. This is how we take information, how we work through that information, and how we get to a new place of knowledge. So when you are challenging somebody, don't be surprised if we get a little bit of disorientation. The correct and professional thing to do is to support them, explore it with them, reorientate them, and get them back to that safe place, which is their equilibrium, having learnt the information. What we don't want is people taking that shortcut. You challenge, they get really narked, they head straight back to where they came from. We need to make sure that we cut that off and get them back to that new equilibrium. Where do you go from here then? We need to slow down. We need to focus our attention. And that's really difficult when we're really busy. But that's one of the things we need to do. We need to cultivate empathy and connection. So we now need to start being able to be curious about people. We need to connect better with people. And there's never been a better time than currently to start connecting with people in a more important and effective way than we might have done before. And then we've got to question ourselves. So we now need to start thinking about, why do I think that? Why am I doing that? Where's the information from that's telling me that? You know, where did I pick it up from? Who from? And have I fact checked it? And that's where we start to think about things from multiple perspectives. So for some of you will be equality impact assessing what you do. That's all that means, step 4. Review multiple perspectives. So you can either do it in a formal route through policy, or you can do it in a more generalized, dynamic way, which is we equality impact assess on our feet around the kind of conversations we're having. Really, really important. And then the commit to action, which is the bit that says, okay, we've just sat for an hour on this webinar. What are we actually going to do? So think about what you can do in relation to managing that unconscious bias. Now you'll know some of yours. You'll know what comes up regularly. You'll have already been given feedback, I would guess. And then think about what support you require to make those changes. Because it's not just about doing it on your own. How do you need your organization to help you? What is it that they could be doing that would give you that support? And sometimes the support to make the changes is asking the people around you to challenge you on the stuff that you're doing, the stuff that you're saying. So if you know that you're a little bit of a loudmouth, or maybe you step in too quickly with stuff, get your colleagues to help you out and tell them you're trying to do something about your unconscious bias and get them to check you on it quite regularly. So think about what you can do now around managing that unconscious bias. I'd like you to start thinking about what you can do in relation to that. Start almost kind of sorting out your own personal action plan as we go through these last couple of slides. Taking time to think before automatically agreeing is a great one. And what I would say about that is be careful of your body language. Because if you're nodding while you're thinking, they've already made their decision that you're agreeing. Yeah. So again, think about how you position yourself within those conversations. And it is much more difficult when we're working remotely. Awareness briefings from top down, absolutely. We need to make sure that whatever we implement it from top to bottom, from bottom to top and across. Because what we don't want to say is that it's happening at the base of the organization. That would be wholly inaccurate. Okay. Unconscious bias happens all over the place and we need to start challenging it. Okay, there's some great ones that are coming in there. Call out and challenge is probably one of the most important ones. Put yourself in someone else's situation, absolutely. But let's not challenge on behalf of other people. Okay? Challenging on behalf of other people is really damaging. So what I mean by that is don't say, oh, you can't say that because such and such wouldn't like it. That's really problematic. Yeah? Do it because you don't like it. Do it because it's not right. Do it because it falls below the standards of the organization. Do it because it breaches legislation. Do it for all of those other reasons, not because you're protecting somebody else. Some of the sessions we run around challenge and effective challenge look more into the reasons why that's important, but be careful you don't fall into that trap of starting to challenge on behalf of the world. That's not your job. Your job is to challenge on behalf of you and the organization that you work for. Has confidence in managing your unconscious bias increased then? And that's a big question to answer on a Poll EV screen. I recognize that, but if it has, in what way? Because we've just had 55 minutes. That's all we've done is go through a section of slides. Not yet, still working on it. I like it. Being mindful of society today. Yeah. And remember, we look back sometimes with rose-coloured spectacles on what it was like before. All those years ago when we were supposed to have a laugh at work. Well, actually, we still have a lot of fun at work. In fact, it's written into our IODA values fun. So we're allowed to. Doesn't mean you can't have a joke. Let's have a look. Okay, there's certainly some stuff going in there. I'm going to open up now to have a look at what else we've got. Yeah, there's one there. I wanted to find that. Yeah, no one can flip in 1 hour. People go back to their work and forget most of what has been told here. You're absolutely right. But remember, one of the unconscious bias was our observational stuff, which means we see things more at different times. So if you've ever, I don't know, bought a new car, for example, you won't see anybody driving that car when you're going around town until you drive yours, and then you see that there's lots of them. Popularity seems to have gone through the roof, but that's your observational bias. Now, what's important about this unconscious bias webinar is you can make a big difference quite quickly if you choose to. Okay, and that's about the conversations you have with the people that you have them with, and making sure that those conversations continue and that it doesn't stop here. All right, the conversation can carry on. Small little steps to make a change, absolutely. Yeah, don't go changing your whole personality off the back of the webinar. Stay who you are, but making small changes will make a difference. Okay, so thank you for today. You'll notice that HS2, Highways England and Network Rail have put this session on for you as part of the Fairness, Inclusion and Respect in Construction with Supply Chain School. Take care. Thank you.